crime, conspiracy, cold cases, and murder. Things I love to deep dive in, and a few of which we are going to be talking about today. And let me just address, yes, this is not my office. I am currently in Caleb's office in Texas, also hence the outfit. I feel like it was just on par with where I am, and also don't expect this kind of quality in any of my future videos, but you can bask in it today. Anyway, today we are talking about the Ant Hill Kids. And no, it is not a small farm town metal cover band made up of hormonal teenagers that hate their stepdads like I originally thought when I heard the name. It is a cult, and quite literally one of the worst cults I have ever personally read about. So for those of you who don't know, here is a quick spiel of what we're going to be getting into today, and y'all are ready. The Ant Hill Kids were a cult led by Roch, a maniacal French-Canadian cult leader active from the late 90s to the early 80s. He led his cult with a blend of paganism, Old Ritual Testament, theology, and mysticism, then eventually evolved into a sadistic, disturbing, doomsday backyard party that also served a side of makeshift operation and bodily mutilation. So let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, a deep dive through this windshield into this cult together. So I truly didn't think I could find a cult more f***ed up than the Children of God, and if you haven't seen that deep dive, you should go check it out right here. But I did. And it all starts with Roch, or should I say Roch, because he's French-Canadian to be exact. So let's go back to this little shit stain's beginnings and get to know how he grew into the giant shit stain he became. So Roch was one of 8 children, and when he was 6, his family moved to a small asbestos mining community in Quebec, Canada, where I'm from. I'm not from Quebec, I'm from British Columbia, on the other side, on the good side. And this place was called Fetfort Mines, and the Terriers were described by neighbors as backwoods people. From local recounts, people said that Roch's mother was relatively normal, whatever the fuck that means, but Roch's father was a religious fanatic, the first ingredient in our up cult leader stew. His father was a part of an authoritarian fascist group of Catholics called the White Berets, named by their distinctive headgear, rebranded today as the Pilgrims of St. Michael. Essentially, this group wanted to destroy, gain, and hand control of all institutions over to the Catholic Church. So they were based in Catholicism. So Roch's father would force his children to go around the neighborhood and essentially knock on all the doors and beg for money to put towards the White Berets and their cause. So people would be opening their doors and be met with little Quebecois children's faces screaming, s'il vous plaît, donne-moi ton argent, est-ce que mon père est fou? And for those of you who don't know, that means, please give me your money, my father is crazy. But our little shit stain Roch didn't actually like going door to door begging for money, believe it or not. He would consider them humiliations of the highest order, and this would instill a deep hate for the Catholic Church within him that would never go away, as we will see. But from a young age, Roch was taught pain. When Roch was a child with his siblings, his father would make them all gather around a dinner table and play a game called Bone. That sounds terrifying. This game consisted of everybody sitting around the table and proceeding to kick each other's shins until they drew blood with either hard boots or steel toe boots. And then the first person to say ouch or stop or dear God, my leg hurts would lose. Which to a certain point, I feel like when I was a kid, we used to like hit each other's hands and see like which one of us ducked out first, but I didn't do it with my father, and I didn't do it to the point of bleeding. So that's pretty fucked up. Another ingredient in our cult leader stew. Roch would also claim his father would push him down the stairs and lock him in the basement cellar. And one of Roch's wives later in life would say that Roch claimed he was beaten relentlessly by his father as a child, so much so that he had internal scarring on his organs. But all these claims could never be confirmed. And what didn't help his story either is, besides his neighbors saying Roch's father was a little odd by being in the White Berets, none of the children ever actually showed signs of, nor did any of the other siblings ever claim any of this ever happened. So you're gonna start seeing a little pattern here of Roch being a manipulative, lying piece of shit, but we'll get more into that as well. But back to his childhood. So Roch was widely known as a troubled kid. He'd steal money and cigarettes from his parents, who didn't, am I right? Just kidding. And he would also blame that on his siblings, so he was probably a middle child or the youngest. In a memoir he wrote that was 173 pages long, he would tell stories of his childhood that I don't even think an actual child would believe to this day. He would create these like grandiose stories that were clearly not real. One of them being this. He said in his memoir that when he was a child, he was walking home from school and he came across a mother bear and her cubs. But instead of her attacking him and killing him like they probably would, she took him in as one of their own and played with him for the entire afternoon. And then he went home and was fine. So there's that. Rock would also lie about ailments that he had as a child to elicit sympathy, which again, I feel like that's something kids kind of do. I faked sick when I wanted to get out of school. So, but am I a cult leader? Did I create a murder mutilation cult? No. He almost had Munchausen syndrome, but he was a complete narcissist as well, so I think it kind of went hand in hand with each other. He would claim to have infantile paralysis until the age of 6, claimed he was unable to speak until the age of 8, and he claimed that he could hardly walk until the age of 12, when he did. Everybody knew that he did. He would just lie. He was just a pathological liar. Now, obviously, none of his claims were true, but there was one that rang to be actually true, and that is that he had a disturbingly large I don't, it was in the book. It was in the book, so I felt like it was important to know. I don't know that that's real. I've not seen a picture, but I'm just going off the literature. So Rock would move into his teenage years, and naturally, at the age of 14, he would come to the conclusion that he was too smart for school and would drop out, which actually he was one of the top students. He had a very high IQ, which helped him in later years, tricking people into being in his cult, as we will learn. So he would work shoveling snow, mowing lawns, and hanging out at bars, as you do when you're 14. Am I right? Just kidding. So in 1967, he met a woman named Francine Gridier, sorry if I butchered your name, at a dance hall, and he would soon after get married. They would move in with one another and have 2 children pretty quickly after they got married. And Rock would get a job at a fire hall doing local inspections. Even though he didn't have a high school education, he was able to talk his way into a lot of jobs, regardless of him not having an education. And it was around this time Rock would start to form into the giant adult shit stain he became. In 1971, he began suffering from duodenal ulcers, and doctors would remove part of his stomach to alleviate some of his symptoms. And by the time he needed his second surgery, he had already gathered a bunch of medical textbooks and would memorize them so that when he went into his second surgery, he was able to recite the surgery step by step. So basically, he was backseat driving his own surgery. I've never heard anything more Canadian than that, and pretentious. And the surgery stuff will come into play later as well. Stay tuned for that. It's up. So although getting multiple surgeries for his ulcers, the pain would not go away, at least according to Crybaby Rock, who was already notorious for over-exaggerating every aspect of his life, including pain, as we know. He was the poster boy and founding father of the man cold, essentially. So this would lead him to become a full-on hypochondriac, convincing people that his insides were made of plastic, and his death was always right around the corner. I wish. This would also lead him to become extremely erratic because his little tummy hurt that somehow gave him license to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, without regard for anyone else. But most noteworthy, this would cause him to have a completely different outlook on sex specifically. For example, at the beginning of Rock's and Francine's marriage, he would make her dress very conservatively. He'd make her wear very long dresses and cover up when they were in public and even when they were at home. But after the surgeries, he would demand her to wear miniskirts, crop tops, and very explicit clothing, and he would not talk to her about anything other than sex. So just your typical male, basically. I'm just kidding. He would even go as far as to ask his in-laws if he could open a nudist colony at their farm, and they would obviously reject his proposal, but I can't even imagine going up to Caleb's parents after meeting them for the first time and just pitching that to them. So Rock is now becoming a full-blown narcissistic piece of shit. And what's the best job for a narcissistic piece of shit? A politician. So he would get into his local council, but not surprisingly be voted out very shortly after, because all the ideas he would bring to the table were extremely grandiose and would literally bankrupt the city if they did any of them. So Rock, still wanting a position of power, would try his hand at working as a Freemason in the Aromas Club. Now, the Aromas Club was a Catholic organization, which, remember, Rock hates Catholics, given his past with his father. So he used this to his advantage. He would gain their trust and gain control over the initiation ceremonies, which ushered in a lot of new members. See where this is going? Yeah, that's where it's going. And in time, Rock would change the rituals to reflect his own hatred for the Catholic Church. Naturally, most of the members of the club would think he's batshit crazy and wouldn't follow him. Rock would then drop out of the club and replace the painkillers for drinking instead, which is awesome. Kidding. And shortly after that, he would soon find his cult niche, which was women. His first disciple being Giselle Tremblay. Giselle would grow up in a very cold and household. Her father would also talk shit to her about her own mother, his wife, and say that she had to be nothing like her own mother because she wasn't completely devoted to him and obeyed everything he said. So this naturally progressed into Giselle having a string of very toxic relationships, the worst being Rock. And this would lead to her mutilation later in the story. They would meet in a bar, and Rock, still being married by the way, would write Giselle love letters and convince her that it hurt him that she had the audacity to sleep with anybody else because she had a boyfriend at the time as well. He would also convince Giselle that his wife was cheating on him, which she wasn't. And he also threw in the fact that he had cancer, but he didn't actually have cancer. I just can't imagine sitting with a guy and being like, please tell me, are you actually married? And he's just like, yes, I'm sorry, but she is a total bitch. And she's just like, and he's like, and I have cancer? Oh my God, you poor baby. Yes, I am a poor baby, so take off all your clothes. I just don't understand. So naturally, this would sway Giselle to leave her life and spend all her free time and work for Rock. They would sell homemade beer mugs at local fairs. Shortly after that, Giselle would leave her current relationship, and Rock would leave his wife and his 2 children behind without looking back. And Giselle and Rock would move to Benford Mines, Quebec. And this is where Rock would become obsessed with religion, reading the Bible incessantly and denouncing the Catholic Church. And this is where he would find passages in the Old Testament that highlighted that women must be submissive towards men, and started to revolve and create his own religion based off of those passages and those passages alone. He basically just looked for the ones he liked and it just built a whole religion around that. He just forgot about the whole, respect your neighbor and your wife, and he just opted for women should be subservient to their husbands. So at this point, Rock did not have a church of his own or any kind of his own following, really. But this is also when a Seventh-day Adventist preacher, Pierre Zita, would move into town and start his own church. Rock, being new to the Seventh-day Adventists, which I'm going to refer to as the SDA because that is a mouthful I don't want to keep repeating, was extremely intrigued from the start because they represented everything Catholicism did not. For those of you who don't know, the SDA are essentialists who preach a simple life with an enormous amount of restriction, aka a prime breeding ground for a cult. The SDA Church is a Protestant denomination characterized by its observance of the biblical Sabbath, which is Saturday, instead of Sunday like most Christian religions, and it emphasizes on the imminent second coming of Jesus Christ. And its fundamental creed is the Bible and the Bible alone. Adventists are also well known for emphasizing healthy lifestyle habits, probably the only good part of this religion. Many SDA members practice vegetarianism and adhere to kosher laws set forth in the book of Leviticus, such as abstinence of shellfish, pork, and other unclean foods. If that's unclean, then call me filthy because I love a bacon-wrapped scallop. SDA members would also practice abstinence from illegal drugs, tobacco, and alcohol. So Rock essentially loved the idea of the coming judgment day more than anything about this religion, specifically the part where everyone on earth would be divided into either the blessed or the damned. Which Rock, being a narcissist, this kind of all made sense because narcissists see themselves as better than everyone else or as the chosen one, so he naturally thought he would be one of the blessed. And he also loved that his entire Catholic family would supposedly be part of the damned group. So he basically loved the idea of his entire family just rotting and burning for eternity in hell. So this was right up Rock's alley. So Pierre Zita, the SDA church preacher, would start his church in Rock's hometown and gain a whole congregation of 6 people. It's pretty sad. So he would preach in rented hotel rooms week to week, and Rock would really enjoy these sessions because he was able to gain the attention of all 6 people, but he liked being able to bitch about his ex-wife and just talk about all of his problems and ailments and have the room be completely captivated because people would say that Rock was extremely charismatic. That's what kind of sets him apart from other cult leaders. He would also start selling SDA books on behalf of the church and become one of the top salesmen. Giselle, his girlfriend, would be baptized in the faith as well. And they would become a team selling these books to the public. Pierre would also promote Rock and allow him to head the therapeutic division of the church, teaching people how to quit smoking within 5 days, guaranteed. And this new position of authority, although small, is believed to have been the fan to Rock's cult flame, giving him a taste of true power and control. So while Rock was busy helping people quit smoking, the other church members were busy recruiting new young members of the SDA church. And this is when a few of Rock's most devoted disciples would join the church, all of which came from abusive homes, which is usually pretty on par for people that join cults. It's usually people that are very lost and don't have direction in their life, so they need that older figure to show them the way. One of those members being Solange Boyard. Solange was raised by an alcoholic father who would often physically and verbally abuse her. Later on, she would become one of Rock's most devoted followers, and later on that would lead to her brutal death, which we will get into later in the video. So Rock would soon be in charge of the new recruits. Great. 4 teenage to early 20-year-olds, teaching them how to be proper SDA members, preaching eating right, freeing themselves from hate, and letting God into their daily lives. While that all sounds not that bad, he would also convince them to drop out of society completely, which is step 1 in any cult leader, basically. They love to separate you from your families and loved ones so you can't think for yourself. So unfortunately, all 4 of these kids would drop everything in their lives and move in with Rock and Giselle in their apartment. They themselves would claim that Rock was extremely entertaining morning and night. But I'm like, where the are these people's parents? Because at this point, they're still in the same city. They're like 18 to 20-year-olds that just left home and went to move in with a 30-something religious guru and his wife. Their parents were just completely fine with this. I don't understand that. But there was one person's parents that actually showed a little bit of concern, thank God. Rock would face backlash from Chantel's parents, one of his other most devoted future disciples, if you will. He would go to their house and he would only really make it worse, saying, you know, you don't have to worry about your daughter. I have much experience in this lifetime. All except for murder, of course. That is a terrible French accent. I'm sorry, I butchered that. But yeah, he basically said, I've done everything in life except for murder. And then he laughed. So they just assumed that he'd probably murder at some point, which he did, and we'll get to that. But Chantel would leave anyway against her parents' wishes and join Rock and Giselle in their apartment as well. Rock would also do this thing where if anybody asked him a question he didn't know how to answer, he would just start chanting really loudly. So they'd be like, Rock, do you intend on sleeping with my underage daughter? And he'd just be like, no. I'm gonna take that. I'm gonna write that down. I like that a lot. Shortly after the original 4 joined, 2 more would join as well. Maurice Lambert, sorry if I said your name wrong, and Josie Palaye? I don't know. So in 2 months, Rock had built a following of 6 women and 2 men who all lived with Rock and Giselle in their apartment, like I said. And this is where things would start to go downhill or uphill, whichever one sucks more. First thing to get weird was the introduction of massage parties. And Giselle wasn't totally on board with this. Giselle being Rock's girlfriend. No kidding. And on top of the fact that there was 8 other people living in her small apartment, I imagine the fridge was empty at all times. And also because 6 other women living in her apartment, she was watching fall in love with her mans. So Giselle, being hesitant about the whole ordeal, would lead Rock to pull out his manipulative deck of cult cards and choose the guilt trip ace of spades, saying that if she truly loved him and God, she would open up her heart and let these strangers sleep in her home. So Giselle inevitably would agree, and Rock would continue collecting followers like Pokemon. Now, most of these followers were in their late teens to early 20s, like I said, and Rock was only in his mid-30s at this point. So most of these kids were looking to go back to school after the summer, because it was during the summer where he recruited all of them. So once fall came around, they were planning on going back, but Rock, absolutely being intoxicated by the attention from his followers, was determined to devise a plan to isolate all of them and eventually and violate them as well. Just your standard cult practices. So by the summer of 1978, Rock had gathered a healthy amount of followers. But since they were planning on leaving and going back to school, like I said, Rock leaned into the beliefs of the SDA and he instilled in them previously and said that the second coming of Christ was coming soon and school was pointless. Oh, I wish my parents believed that when I was a kid. I hated school. So naturally, the kids would relent and stay with Rock. Now, you have to understand that Rock, although he does share some similar qualities to many cult leaders, he was not off-putting at all, or creepy or awkward in any means, such as cult leaders like Marshall Applewhite or Jim Jones. Rock was said to be extremely charismatic and charming by most people, even people outside of the cult. So he essentially could talk his way into or out of anything, as we will see. So Rock would continue to teach at the stop smoking clinics, where he would use to double as a recruitment center for his new followers. So at this time, the cult still revolved around healthy and spiritual living, with a hint of inevitable doomsday around the corner, but some of the followers' families were growing more and more concerned about Rock, naturally. So what does a cult leader do when people are starting to grow suspicious of them and their intentions? They get the hell out of Dodge. In this case, he would take the first step, I'd say step 3. He'd take this third step into true culthood and move himself and his following to a little town called Ste. Marie, Quebec, where no one in his following had any familial connections, so he could really separate them and isolate them from anything that they knew previously, and would completely depend on him. And this is where he would open the Healthy Living Clinic under the umbrella of the SDA Church. And Rock would slowly turn this entire operation into an overt cult. And step 4 or 5, I don't know how many steps we're at, into any good cult is to take away any individuality at all. So Rock would force everyone to wear these super stylish uniforms. And by super stylish, I mean tunics, ankle-length tunics with rope around the waist. I just picture Viserys from Game of Thrones. Pretty cool. And the women would be forced to wear a light green tunic, and the men would be forced to wear beige. And Rock, being the leader, he would get to choose his own outfit, obviously, and he would choose a brown tunic. I figured he'd choose something cooler than that. I would personally, if I was a cult leader, not that I would be, I'd probably dress in like 80s Jane Fonda workout gear, so I could equally look stylish and be able to run away from the police when I inevitably get caught. So Rock is now living out in Ste. Marie, Quebec, with Giselle, his girlfriend, and his followers. And Giselle was naturally growing very weary and jealous of all of these women at this point. And to shut her up, Rock would propose to her and marry her. And he would marry her and drive to Montreal to do so in his pickup truck. And after they did get married, he would drive back to Ste. Marie, and he would throw Giselle in the back of the truck bed that was open in January in Canada, and then he would sit in the cab with Solange and Chantel, his most devoted followers, and flirt and probably get a little freaky up there. So for their honeymoon, she was literally freezing her ass off in the back of a truck bed, and he was in the front seat. So eventually the other SDA leaders would grow jealous of Rock's hold on his followers, and they would end up voting him out of the church, hoping that his followers would go to them. But it actually did the complete opposite. It showed that the church would just drop you at the drop of a hat if you did anything that they didn't like. So his followers grew even more devoted to Rock and would follow him. So Rock would begin molding his following together by marrying each of them off to each other. Even if they weren't remotely attracted to each other or didn't like each other, he would force them to get married to each other. And it was at this point where the cult still didn't revolve around sex completely like it would in the future. In fact, Giselle said that Rock only had sex with her to shut her up, basically. And Giselle would say, quote unquote, having sex with Rock is like having sex with a fridge. This guy was big, by the way. He was a big hulking man, but I just imagined him laying there, some condiments on his arms. I don't know. So by 1978, Giselle would fall pregnant with Rock's child, but she would also fall completely out of love with Rock and grow tired of him flirting with other women in her own home constantly, which is fair. And this is where the first act of violence would occur in this cult. Rock, obviously not agreeing with Giselle's decisions to leave, would punch his pregnant wife in the face until she was black and blue, and then lock her in a room for over 2 days without food and water. So at this point, the cult was at a crossroads. The SDA Church was no longer supplying them with natural food products or literature to sell, and debt collectors were knocking at Rock's doors constantly. So Rock did what Rock does best, and he skit town with his followers, and Giselle coming along with them. So at this point, he had 12 women, 6 men, and 2 children. Because if you have a problem, just run away from it. So at this point, Rock would really start spreading paranoia of the second coming. Because step 8, I don't know, in cult tactics is to instill fear in everyone from leaving. So he would start instilling fear of the second coming of Christ and convince his followers this was the best course of action, to leave, that is. He would say the day of Jesus coming back was going to be July 6th, and the day of reckoning would be February 17th of the following year. So he gave himself some time to think of some other bullshit to tell them, which he would, which we'll get to. And he would convince them that he was God's personal emissary, and since he was, and they were completely tied to him, they would make it into heaven. As long as they stayed in the cult, they would make it into heaven. If they left, they'd be burning down in hell with Satan. And he would convince them as well that they must return to nature so that when Jesus Christ did come back and he would do his 1,000-year reign, he would have a place to hang. Because apparently Jesus Christ likes to hang out in the woods, which is awesome. He would also convince them that the world was full of quote-unquote satanic child out to drink your blood, which true. If anyone outside the church was to say otherwise, they themselves would be satanic child. So every point you look at, he had an answer for everything and as to why you can't leave the cult and you should stay. So at this point, Rock and his followers would set out on foot and find their new isolated sanctuary. And this sanctuary would be called Eternal Mountain, pretty sick name, which was a 4-hour walk from any sort of civilization. And they would quickly start to build a community and compound from scratch. Starting at 5 a.m. every single day, they would wake up, cut down trees, haul rocks, and build. While Rock, unsurprisingly, supervised because he had cancer and his tummy hurt. He didn't do shit. He didn't do shit except everybody, but we'll get to that. And naturally, being in the middle of the woods, there was no grocery stores nearby. Or, anyone that really knew how to hunt or forage, so they starved regularly. And if any of the members were to disobey Rock in any way, he would make their rations even smaller. And the cherry on top is Rock would also pull a Jim Jones card and recite sermons all through the night so his followers wouldn't sleep. So these people were starved and sleep deprived, which made them incredibly suggestible, even more so than they already were. They would also be stripped of their own identity, Rock taking away all of their given names, and he would give them names that were from the Old Testament. And Rock, the leader of the cult, would naturally give himself the humble name of Moses, which was also the same name that the leader of Children of God gave himself. Very humble, very humble. So all these people are up in the forest, sleep deprived, starving, scared, and lonely, and the number of women far outweighed the number of men. And Giselle, Rock's wife, would take notice and address it to Rock. She basically said that, all the women up here are miserable because they don't have partners, or most of them didn't have partners. So Rock would do a little Uno reverse card and flip it on Giselle. And he would open his Bible and pick a couple scriptures that played into his favor. So he would go into the Old Testament and find the scripture of King David and King Solomon that would declare that he should take on the difficult task of sleeping with all the women in the cult. And he would tell all the members that this was Giselle's idea, all right? She brought it up and this isn't me, all right? Giselle's crazy, but she said it, so we should do it. So it was around this time, November 18th, 1978, that Jonestown would happen, the mass that happened in Guyana under the cult leader Jim Jones. Also, let me know if you want me to do that. I know I mentioned in every cult video that I've done so far, but let me know if you want me to deep dive on that. The People's Temple mass suicide would terrify people globally about cults, and civilians and authorities were growing suspicious of cults growing in their communities, especially in the US and in Canada. So word would spread quickly about a giant French-Canadian man and his followers gathering at a place called Eternal Mountain out in the woods in Quebec, Canada. So authorities would put everyone in the cult under a psych evaluation, but they would all pass, saying they were all sound of mind and all expressed that they were there out of their own free will. Rock would also be tested, but would unfortunately pass as well, with the psych eval people even saying, quote, unquote, although he has slight schizophrenic hallucinations and tendencies, he was of sound mind. Listen, I'm not a doctor, but that makes no sense. So after evading the authorities, Rock would annul all current marriages within the cult, and every woman would be forced to marry Rock. What? Oh, I didn't see this coming. That's crazy. That's crazy. That's what every cult leader does. It's like there's a handbook that they all read at the same time, but there's not. So it's weird. So all the women would be married to Rock and Rock alone. Most days in the cult would consist of everyone else working outside and Rock taking 2 or more women into his bedroom and sleeping with them all through the day and night. Some of the women were more than happy to oblige to this, but some of them were still not completely on board, but they were too scared to say anything, so they'd just go along with it. And if you think that's fucked up, just wait, because it gets way worse. If you're eating a snack right now, for example, I'm going to give you a forewarning that you're probably going to hate whatever you're eating in the next half of this. So the women in the cult naturally quickly got jealous of one another, all sleeping with the same man. What? So all of them would begin writing love letters to Rock in competition with one another. One of them would say, quote unquote, "Adored Pappy, well-loved master, my heart is sliding next to your immense father's heart. You have brought a lot of peace to me. I am happy about the lovely family you have formed and allowed me to be part of. Thank you equally for the promise of better days. I feel very good and being at your side and to be one of your children and to live simply but fully." She sucked at commas. "And before finishing, I would like to tell you again before I had the impression of losing my breath the other night. I am slime, I am less than nothing, and I beg your pardon for all of the errors of my flesh. I love you, Pappy." That was another name that they gave him, was Pappy. It was either Pappy or Moses. There was no in between. Love, Thirsta. P.S. Please excuse my handwriting. Her name was Thirsta. That's what he gave her the name of, which fits, because Thirsta was thirsty. Sorry, I had to. If I start sweating, I'm sorry. And also, I'm nervous because this is going to get really gross really soon. So obviously, Rock was loving the devoted attention from his female followers, and also came to the conclusion that following the SDA scripture was devoid of purpose. It was getting kind of lame for him. He kind of wanted to make his own rules. Given that all his followers were following him and not the church per se, he decided to do whatever the he wanted. So he abandoned vegetarianism, started eating and drinking Pepsi, alcohol, and his favorite being cognac, and would consume things like potato chips, fries, just all the good stuff. And this would in fact truly lead him into his violent masochistic behavior that would make this seemingly mild-mannered cult at the time turn into the stuff of nightmares. For example, we know Rock would love to rant about himself in his sermons. And if someone had the audacity to fall asleep during one of these sermons because, you know, they were all sleep deprived, Rock would take a wooden club and beat them awake. And when one of his pregnant female members ate one too many pancakes at breakfast one morning, he would beat her as well and break a couple of her ribs. But some of the more particular cruelties, however, were inflicted upon children of the cult, which is disgusting. I'd hope this piece of shit is just rotting in hell and just being burnt, and Satan's doing all the things he did to people in hell. But anyway, at this point, Rock had impregnated almost all of the women in the cult besides one member, Maurice, which we'll talk about later. But there were also other children that were there before Rock's children came along, and they would be treated like they were less than human, to say the least. He would literally treat them like animals, making them sleep separate from their parents, often in sheds, even if they were infants, by the way. And when one of the mothers, Maurice, 6-month-old baby, was crying too much, Rock would order her to strip her baby naked and roll him in the snow until he was completely blue. Maurice being the only woman in the cult that was not wed to Rock, like I said before, because her husband was Rock's right-hand man and he let him have a wife of his own. And Maurice was not on board with Rock at any point, basically. She only joined the cult because Maurice's husband was so devoted to Rock. Naturally, Maurice decided she was fed up with the abuse she and her children were receiving and she wanted to leave the cult. But Rock would not let her, and this would give him an opportunity to assert his dominance within the cult. He would force Maurice's husband, Jacques, to cut off one of her toes in front of the other cult members. And Jacques would be hesitant at first, thank God. Rock would say that if Jacques didn't cut off one of her toes, Rock would cut off all of them. So Jacques inevitably took an axe and proceeded to cut off one of Maurice's toes. And this would be the first in mutilation he made Jacques do, but Rock would do a lot of that in the future. So this would help solidify the fear of disobeying or leaving the cult completely. So February 17th, 1979 would eventually roll around. Remember, this was the day that Jesus was supposed to come back and hang out in the woods. But this never happened. What? It's crazy. What did Rock do? Did they all leave because they were smart? No. Rock's explanation to this would be that Time just works differently in heaven. Yep, I forgot to mention that before, but that's why he didn't come back. It's just crazy. He said that 1 second in heaven can equate to 40 years on earth. So the people in the cult were in constant fear that Jesus Christ was going to come back, because there was no actual time frame anymore. And it was at this time Quebec City would do a piece on the Anthill Kids, which is the cult we're talking about right now. But it was nothing but positive feedback, with the headline reading, quote, "They are happy and they are free to live if they wish." That was the headline. The outside world looking in literally thought Rock was just this awesome, rugged, Canadian, free-spirited man who f***ed a lot of bitches, and people like that for some reason. I don't know. They looked up to him because he had all these devoted people around him. And they thought this because their main source for information in this article came from a cult member that had left very, very early on, when it was just nothing but a positive cult, and said that he was even debating going back to the cult, and that Rock was just this open, free-loving guy that taught him about God, etc. So that's the opinion that the outside world had on Rock and his cult. But it would garner the attention of authorities again, and they would be forced to be put under psych eval again. All passing with flying colors, except for Rock this time. Rock would be put in a mental institution to get his assessment done after his first initial one. But Rock, being the manipulative that he was, would call the press and switch the script, pull the Uno reverse card, and say that the psych people were completely against him and that they were evil, and the press would already be on his side, so they would print articles about how terrible the asylum was, so they would inevitably let Rock go. As a result of Rock's manipulative tactics with the public and a lack of proper investigative journalism, people were about to start dying as a result in the cult. Now, Rock, if you remembered, was previously married to Francine. You know, the woman he married and had 2 kids with and just abandoned out of nowhere and slept with multiple other women. That Francine? Classic Rock. But after Rock made the commune into something that he could be proud of, he would convince Francine to come back with his kids to visit on multiple occasions. And she would come back because he was just this charismatic guy who nobody could say no to for some reason. But one night when she and her kids came back, Rock was showing his feat of strength. He would just like to stand on stage and just do random shit. Dude would blow bubbles on stage and everybody would be like, you know? So he was up on stage, but he was bending 12-inch nails into V shapes, and everybody in the cult was clapping and singing his praises, and Francine, knowing that he's just an idiot, just burst out laughing while he was doing this. But this would be a tragic mistake, as Rock would immediately stop what he was doing and proceed to punch and kick and beat Francine while she screamed for help from the people around her, because the whole cult was watching at this point. Not one of them said a word or did anything while he was doing this. Also in front of her children, because at this point they were not remotely surprised by Rock's random bursts of rage and violence. And she would live, but she wouldn't come back to the commune after that. And from here, the violence and overall darkness would continue to escalate into new levels. Now, as we know, Rock treated the children that weren't his own like pieces of shit. At this point, he would ban them from receiving any sort of love from their families at all. They would be forced to work every single day and sleep in sheds, even outside sometimes, which if you live in Canada, you know 80% of the year, especially moving up north, is pretty much not survivable. And this would be the case for one of the children. Samuel Jagar, a 2-year-old, was crying one night in the commune, and Rock, not liking the sound of crying children, decided that the only thing to remedy this would be to circumcise the child. So he would take a razor blade and do just that to the kid while it was awake. And Rock, thinking that he needed some sort of antiseptic to help, Rock would pour pure ethanol into a plastic bulb and pump it into Samuel's stomach. And before long, Rock killed the 2-year-old through acute alcohol poisoning. Like, the things that he does, like, they don't make sense. Like, even I know, you know, I'm not a doctor, nor is he, but I know that pumping, you know, pure ethanol into a child's stomach is going to kill them. So he just didn't care. He had no regard for anybody's life, especially the kids that weren't his. After he killed the boy, he would insist that the other cult members incinerate his body, so if any authorities were to come up to the cult, all the evidence would be gone. He would also blame the child's death on one of the other male members, because the other cult members didn't actually know that Rock committed this crime, basically. So he would essentially create his own makeshift court, him being the judge, obviously, and some of the other cult members being the prosecutor, the defender, and jury. Naturally, it would rule in Rock's favor, and he would sentence the male member, Guy Vier, to be castrated with a razor blade. This guy just loved mutilating people's genitals, as you will come to see. But he would not stop there. Through the weeks following, he would often get completely obliterated off alcohol and tie Guy Vier to a tree and beat him until he was black and blue. And he often told the members to gather round and stab him to death, but once they got just close enough, he would tell them to stop and would laugh and would just basically bask in the fact that he could tell his followers to do anything, even stab a man to death, and they wouldn't hesitate. Luckily, Guy, after months of abuse, would sneak out of the compound and go to authorities to tell them all the atrocities that Rock had done. So authorities, for once, would do their job and storm the compound, arresting Rock along with 3 members of the cult, while also having the children removed from the compound. But Rock would only rot in jail for 2 years. 2 years. What the f***? For killing a toddler. It's crazy. And the others had lesser sentences, and not a single member of the cult over this time period would leave the cult. They would all just sit and wait for Rock to come back. He would also manage to get 3 of the cult members pregnant during his imprisonment. This is the Canadian judicial system, by the way. It's just... I don't understand why they're letting this freak procreate behind bars. That is just beyond me. So in February 1984, Rock would be released from prison. And given he was banned in Quebec from having communications from the other members that also got arrested, he decided to pick up his cult and take them to Ontario, Canada, because the laws didn't apply in Ontario, which that makes no sense. So he would move them to a 200-acre lot east of the Burnt River, where the worst of the atrocities would be committed. On this new compound, Rock would force his members to build a 2-story house, a bakery, and a sugar shack where they made maple syrup. I hate that this shit stain is associated with our Canadian delicacy, but he is. And at this point, Rock had 12 members and 13 children in his cult. And each member would get a specific job on the compound, whether it was building, baking, being Rock's personal hairdresser, or even being Rock's personal masseuse. Pass. Rock was struggling to keep the compound afloat, though, with how little money they had and how poorly the crops were producing in that area, because near Burnt River, the soil just didn't produce crops. So he would convince his followers to start shoplifting and begging for money outside of the compound. But when that still wasn't enough, Rock would decide to get into the fruit business, as one does. And he would send a couple of his members down to Niagara Peninsula, which was also known as Ontario's fruit basket. Who would have thunk? So the whole plan was to bring up hundreds of pounds of fruit and sell them to the locals around their compound. And this business model would prove to be extremely successful, and he would create a company around it called none other than the Anthill Kids. Oh my god, she said the name of the video that we're watching in the name of the cult. Yep, that's where it came from. That's where it came from, a fruit company. So let's get into some of the atrocities. First of which were which mostly were consensual. So Rock would take 2 to 8 of the women to come into his room and have sex with him. And those that weren't having sex with him had to massage him. And even after Rock finished, he would make all the women pleasure themselves while he watched. He's just a giant cuck. And after that, he would encourage jealousy amongst the women. He would draw a square in the middle of the floor, make them undress and beat each other naked to see who was the best women in the compound, basically. Giving and taking away points whether one got pushed out or one was able to stay in. He would even get some of the men to stand in the circle, but since he said that other men couldn't beat on the women of the cult, the men would just stand in the square and just get the shit kicked out of them by these husky, forest-dwelling, cutthroat women. Rock wouldn't stop there, though. He would often, at random, just beat his followers without any warning, sometimes hitting their head with the flat side of an axe or a club. He would circumcise some of the members, and one of his favorites was stripping them naked and beating on them, forcing them to open their mouths while he did it. Rock would also often force the children to join the as well, making them watch the and even making them participate in some of the scenarios. I hate you, you piece of shit. He would also force them to in front of him, and he would say that this was just a form of education. And if there was any kind of retaliation or disobedience from the children, he would often throw them against trees, throw them in freezing lakes nearby, crush their fingers, even nail them to trees via their clothing as a mock crucifixion and force the other kids and adults to stone them. He would even hold 2 babies over a fire at one point while the mothers screamed for him to stop, and he would just laugh, saying that he might throw one of them in the fire for fun. He never did, but what the f***? This was quite literally a horror movie that they lived in. And again, Rock had literally convinced these people that God would strike them down if they left at any moment. So it was just one of those horrible brainwashing scenarios where no one in the cult felt that they could leave or retaliate in any way until it got really, really bad, which we haven't even gotten there yet. Luckily though, Maurice, the only member that was married to another cult member and that was on the edge of leaving the whole time, and mother of the 2-year-old that got poisoned by Rock, was able to leave the commune due to Rock feeling that she was too much of a liability because she was talking too much shit in the cult, and he didn't want her changing the other cult members' minds, essentially. So Maurice would leave, and then she would track down a social worker and authorities and would tell them about all the atrocities that were happening up at Eternal Mountain. And luckily, they would go to the compound and take away the children from Rock and their mothers and put them into foster care. Thank God. But Rock did not give a shit about the kids leaving. He basically saw this whole situation as a necessary sacrifice to keep his up fantasy land thriving. And you'd think that the police would have enough evidence to return Rock to prison, but he would play upon the sensibilities of the assigned child psychologist, who he believed this psychologist would not only exonerate Rock, but express admiration for all the work he'd done in bringing children back to the state of nature. What the He was basically painted as a victim in a prejudiced society, and it was recommended by the psychologist that the children would be given back. What? They weren't, but thankfully they weren't. The request was overruled by a competent judge, and the children were taken away for good. But this broke something in Rock. It unlocked an even more vile and violent man anyone knew that he was capable of, and the atrocities would just keep getting worse, because now that the children were gone, he didn't care at all. Not that he even cared before, but let's get into it. So with the children gone, the behavior of the Anthill kids deteriorated into a cycle of and violence. And Rock would grow even more dangerously unstable as time went on, burning the skin off several cultists with a welding torch, striking one of his pregnant wives so hard in the stomach that she would suffer a miscarriage. He would often use pliers to yank out the teeth of his followers just on a whim for no reason. And he would also just beat, stab, and shoot them. They were like his playthings, basically. Everybody was just a piece of meat sitting around for Rock. He'd even force one of the members, Claudette, to eat human feces and a dead mouse. And after all these acts that he would commit, he would always collapse onto his knees immediately after and beg for forgiveness from God, asking why God is making him commit all of these atrocities against his followers. So he would just, blame God, blame the guy in the sky, okay? It was not any of his fault. And this is something that so many cult leaders do as well. They just say like, well, he told me to, so I don't know what to say. By 1988, the physical cost of this lifestyle, with lack of sleep, nutrition, and constant violence, was beginning to show in poor health in Rock's followers. But Rock would show no mercy. Solange Boyard in particular. Solange would express how she was suffering from stomach pain at the time, and you'd think because Rock himself was constantly suffering from stomach pain from his previous surgeries, he'd have some sympathy, and because she was one of his favorites, but he didn't care at all. And he would commit, in my opinion, the worst atrocity to Solange. So instead, he would make her undergo a makeshift operation done by Rock himself. He began by giving Solange an enema consisting of molasses, oil, and water. And then he would proceed to cut open her stomach and rip out her intestines with his bare hands, flooding the abdominal cavity with digestive acids. The cult would also watch all of this happen and not say a single word, out of complete fear. Even with Solange screaming and writhing in pain, he forced a couple of the other cult members to crudely stitch her up while she was still alive, and they would just leave her on the floor in that building, just screaming in pain until she inevitably died hours later. But even after her death and being buried, Rock grew even more mad. Convinced he could rise her from the dead, he would force his disciples to dig her body back up, cut open her skull, and make them join him into her decaying brain. It's just terrible. He would then cut out some of her ribs as well and make them into a necklace, convinced that one day he would, like Adam, give birth to Solange by biblical means. This man was single-handedly the most evil human being I have ever come across, and I hope to God he's rotting in hell, like I've said before, and that Satan is doing all these atrocities to him and the other people that did them as well for eternity. Anyway, let's continue. Since one of the members, Gabrielle, had joined, she had always been one of the members singled out by Rock, and not in a good way. He would rip out 8 of her teeth just because she said one of her teeth in the back of her mouth was hurting. He would just rip out 8 of them with pliers. But on July 29th, 1989, he would commit the final act of torture that would bring him and his cult crashing down. Gabrielle would complain about a stiff finger, and he would remedy this by impaling her right hand with a hunting knife and pinning it on the kitchen table. And he would leave her there for hours, just with her screaming in pain and bleeding profusely. But she was desperate to avoid passing out because she didn't want the same thing to happen to her that happened to Solange, because as soon as Solange lost consciousness, that's when they ended her life. So she was just trying to stay awake the whole time. And he would come back while she was still awake, but he would free her by severing her arm between her shoulder and elbow with a box cutter. Gabrielle would somehow survive the torture though, and run away to a women's shelter shortly after her arm got cut off. But one of the members of the cult would go to the women's shelter and somehow convince her to come back. And the cult member that convinced her to come back had recently had the tip of his cut off by Rock, just out of a whim. So you could just see how incredibly brainwashed these people were. So Gabrielle would return, and a few days later, in August 1989, Rock would make his followers hold Gabrielle down as he heated a drive shaft with a torch and apply it to the stump of her arm. 3 days later, she would thankfully run away again to the same women's shelter and go to the hospital. But even then, questioned by police in the hospital, Gabrielle would still stick with Rock and say that he had nothing to do with it and that she got in a freak car accident. But the inconsistencies in her story didn't add up. So on August 9th, the authorities would return to the compound to search and arrest, only to find that everyone in the cult had vanished. But don't worry, this isn't some Roanoke situation, all right? We're gonna get the justice we deserve, so stick with me. The dismemberment of Gabrielle turned out to be the last straw for a lot of Rock's members, and they grew the courage to flee, along with Rock as well, but would flee not only by himself, but with his other devoted members, Nicole, Chantel, and Jacques. And they would manage to evade capture for a full 2 weeks, hiding in a makeshift camouflage shed in and around the compound that was there before. So clearly the police didn't search that well, but whatever. And this is when Giselle, Rock's second wife, would tell the authorities about Solange's death, and he would be tried for murder. On December 18th, the judge ordered Rock Theriault to be held on trial for second-degree murder. On January 18th, Rock would be sentenced to only 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole for good behavior. And that's the Canadian judicial system in a nutshell for you. Genuinely, it's fucking terrible, as we see time and time again. On a little side note, in regards to that specifically, do you know that Canadian serial killer that I talked about that murdered and mutilated over 49 women? He got charged a little over 20 years ago, and he's eligible to seek parole now. So go yourself, Canadian Supreme Court. Anyway, so after Rock got charged and sentenced, most of his followers would disappear into anonymity, but a couple would go to seek help and even write memoirs about the horrific experiences that they had at the compound, including Gabrielle and Rock's eldest sons. But Francine, Chantel, and Nicole would rent houses near the prison and continue to follow Rock, even getting impregnated by him while living there. And although Rock was able to charm a few of his followers and some of the prison psychiatrists even, he was not able to sway his fellow prisoners. This is where it gets great. In April 1993, Rock was transferred to the Kingston Penitentiary for his own protection against the other prisoners because they all hated him. But this would be unsuccessful. Oh, what? No! On February 23rd, 2011, prison videos show Rock's cellmate, Matthew Gerard McDonald, Rock in the neck to death with a shiv. McDonald would shortly walk up to the guards outside of their cell and say to them,
"That piece of shit is downrange. Here's the knife. I've sliced him up."
That's just metal. That's pretty, I don't know what he did personally, but he did some good that day at least. And on that MVP badass note, that concludes my deep dive video. I know it was a long one, so I appreciate you sticking around, but my God, was it interesting, disturbing, and informative during my research. So I hope that you enjoyed it as well. And if you liked the video, please like the video. It really helps out the channel. And also subscribe if you haven't subscribed. This is obviously Bessie's YouTube channel ever. And also, sorry I look like this. It is what it is. Bye.